Hello, Ghost of Hugh Nibley here. This is part 2 in defense of the Book of Abraham. Most of the controversy around the Book of Abraham centers on the scrolls. So that's a good place to start, right? Listen, when Joseph Smith, Joseph Coe, Simeon Andrews, and other church members purchased 4 mummies and associated papyrus scrolls from traveling showman and salesman Michael Chandler in the summer of 1835, eyewitness accounts and the remaining fragments show that there are at least 2 very long scrolls and at least 3 other sets of papyri. The long scrolls could have been up to 24 feet and 42 feet long based on accepted formula used by Egyptologists to estimate scrolls' length from the surviving fragments. After Joseph Smith's death, the scrolls were in his mother's possession, who showed them to people for a small fee. When Lucy Mack Smith passed away, Emma quickly sold them. The fragile scrolls have broken apart. Some fragments ended up in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, while most of them apparently went to a museum in Chicago, which burned down in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, taking the scrolls with it. The fragments in the Metropolitan Museum in New York went back to the church in 1967, and pictures were quickly published by the church in the Improvement era. Since the transfer of the 10 papyrus fragments, there have been many attacks and defenses on the book. Here are some of the basic facts. The fragments from the Met are only a portion of the text that Joseph Smith had in his possession, okay? Which he purchased from Michael Chandler. As mentioned before, the best evidence is that Joseph had 4 scrolls and 1 hypocephalus, round in shape. 2 of the scrolls were longer than the other 2. Estimates are that the 11 fragments in the church's possession today equal to about 2.5 to 5% of the original total. Number 2. The fragments do not contain any text that could be translated as the current Book of Abraham. The scrolls contained the 3 books of the dead text and 1 book of breathings. However, they likely contained other unidentified texts, a common occurrence in the missing portions. The Hypocephalus Facsimile 2 is a document that goes on or under the head to represent resurrection. Number 3. The scrolls came from Thebes and belong to Egyptian priests. They date to the Ptolemaic period of Egyptian history, from the first half of the 2nd century to the late 3rd century BC. These facts about the scrolls have led to questions that critics use to conclude that the Book of Abraham was a fictional creation of Joseph Smith's active imagination. They claim that because the fragments in possession of the church today do not contain any text that equates to the Book of Abraham, this proves he made it all up, and thus not a prophet. As we'll see, this amazing leap of logic is not supported by all the facts in any way, and there is substantial evidence supporting the claims that it is an ancient text, which evidence is ignored by the critics, because there is no refutation. Specifically, they raise the following questions. There are others, but these summarize the main concerns. Why did Joseph Smith say the scrolls were written by the hand of Abraham when they're not from Abraham's time? How could Joseph Smith claim to translate the Book of Abraham from scrolls that only contain Egyptian funerary texts? And since modern Egyptologists disagree with Joseph Smith's interpretation of Egyptian characters, doesn't that prove he was wrong? Now, I broke new ground with my studies on the book, especially the messages of Joseph Smith papyri. 4 current LDS scholars have gone well beyond Nibley's efforts and led the way in answering many questions about this book. John Gee, Michael Rhodes, Kerry Millerstein, and Brian Hauglid. The first 3 are professional Egyptologists, while Hauglid is an Arabist whose involvement came through his work translating Arabic texts around Abraham. Here's the answers. Number 1. Why did Joseph Smith say the scrolls were written by his own hand when they're not from Abraham's time? The heading on the first publication of the translation introduced it by saying it was the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand. The heading remains attached to the Book of Abraham in the proliferate price today. Critics say that Joseph Smith was obviously deceived.
It should be at least 4,000 years old. If it's going to date back to Bible times when Abraham lived, it would be 4,000 years old. But after it was evaluated, even Professor Nibley of BYU had to agree that it was a production no older than the 1st century AD, not even close to Abraham's time. Abraham absolutely could not have written this.
Thanks, Jesse, for twisting my words around. Here is the oldest well-preserved manuscript from the book of John. It's called Papyrus 66, and it dates back to no earlier than 200 AD. Does that mean that John absolutely could not have written this either? Think about it, Jesse.
Abraham absolutely could not have written this.
Yeah, I didn't think so. They are not distinguishing an original text versus a copy of that text. No more than the Bible over there on my desk is the original publication of John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Additionally, the identity of the scrolls turns out to be something that supports their authenticity, a fact that critics ignore. The Joseph Smith papyri came from Thebes and were owned by people whose names were known from the fragments. Horus. The Horus scroll is probably the most interesting because it is the possible source of the Book of Abraham. Since facsimile 1 came from the beginning of the scroll, Hor was a Theban priest and access to great libraries, including stories of Abraham and other biblical figures. Copies of such stories about biblical figures are often found on scrolls of this time and place, so finding something about Abraham on Hor's scroll would be completely expected. All right, how could Joseph Smith claim to translate the Book of Abraham from scrolls that only contain Egyptian funerary texts? In spite of the fact that everyone agrees that the fragments in possession of the church represent only a fraction of the total scrolls purchased by Michael Chandler, critics want to claim that the Book of Abraham had to come from the text represented by these itty-bitty tiny fragments. Since Joseph Smith was looking at a Book of Breathings text and produced the Book of Abraham, they conclude, well, it must be a false because the two aren't related. Really? This is the strongest argument critics make? And is completely disingenuous and even irrelevant, as you should recognize with only a bit of scholarly honesty. As with the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith didn't leave any detail about how the Book of Abraham was translated. Joseph Smith claims to have brought forth the Book of Abraham through translating, but never claims to have known Egyptian. Perhaps a better word for Joseph would have been interpret or revealed instead of translate. Regarding portions of facsimile 2, or the hypocephalus that Smith interprets, he only interprets those portions symbolic that have been left open for interpretations by various Egyptologists today. If you look at the parts where Smith writes, quote, ought not to be revealed at the present time, end quote, those portions are phonetic hieroglyphs that can be translated today. And Smith did not attempt to reveal, translate, interpret any of them. What critics always fail to mention when discussing the Egyptian writing system is this. Quote, visually, hieroglyphics are all more or less figurative. They represent real or abstract elements, sometimes stylized and simplified, but all generally perfectly recognizable in form. However, the same sign can, according to context, be interpreted in diverse ways, as a phonogram, as a logogram, or as an ideogram. Most important for the critics to continue to insist that the scrolls can only be Egyptian funerary texts and nothing else when we know the scrolls were significantly larger than the small fragments available to examine today, and that there are multiple examples of such scrolls containing the other text. It's simply dishonest. and the very least they should concede that the ancient text of the Book of Abraham could have been in the missing sections. Sadly, this narrow-minded funerary text-only argument pulls many away from asking the far more important questions about the content of the Book of Abraham, which I mentioned in Part 1, which leads us to the end of Part 2.